What am I doing with my career? It seemed that my sole purpose was just to make a space look pretty. So I spent some time thinking this through and played around with the idea of what we were actually creating. And then I realized there was a much deeper side to designing a space and how significant a space can really be. We create spaces full of emotion and contentment, where people are cared for, spaces that support families and livelihoods. The impact we create might not be an obvious one, but it's an extremely important one. Let's take a look at our learning objectives for today. We start off by understanding the floor plan, what the floor plan is. We develop knowledge of the floor plan, what makes up a floor plan, what do we need to use to create our floor plans. We learn some of the vital terminology associated with these plans. We understand where the plan fits into the design timeline. And lastly, and most excitingly, we develop the ability to create our very own hand-sketched floor plans. Very exciting, but let's look at some of the information that gets us to this point. Our lesson today is all about the plan. We're in lesson 2 and it is called The Plan. What is the floor plan? The perfect place to start. Do you remember from our lesson 1, we looked at everything to do with the floor plan? Pop your answers in your Morpheus text box if you can remember what the floor plan was. The correct definition of floor plan is a scale diagram of a room or building viewed from above. The floor plan may depict an entire building, one floor of a building, or a single room. It may also include measurements, furniture, appliances, or anything else necessary to the purpose of that plan. The floor plan will include elements such as walls, windows, doors. It may have measurements, furniture, appliances. It'll detail the purpose of the plan and show any notations or any information relevant to the project. A floor plan is a drawing that indicates the placement of the structural items and fixed items within a space. It's generally a 2D drawing created by sketching or using computer-aided software like AutoCAD and Revit. The floor plan is where we note any details relevant to the space, and it's a section through a building showing us the layout of the space internally. Let's break that up. Your floor plan is a scaled diagram. It shows us a view from above, so as if someone was looking down on into the space. It indicates the size of the space with measurements, and another term for this could be your dimensions. And it shows us how furniture has been placed within that space. So in essence, your floor plan shows us exactly what functions will be taking place in those spaces or in your spaces, and how the traffic flow is set up in the design. As the designer, you would have a variety of different floor plans that you'd need to be working on, and therefore would be required to draw up many different kinds of floor plans for a number of various reasons. The key of a floor plan is to communicate. So each plan would communicate a different aspect of your project. So let's look at some of the scenarios you may find yourself drawing up a floor plan for. You may draw a furniture plan or furniture floor plan, and this is typically your standard floor plan or starting block floor plan. You may need to draw up a setting out plan or setting out floor plan, and this would indicate dimensions of how everything is set up within the space and on the floor plan. You may need to do a wet works floor plan, everything to do with plumbing and water. You may be required to do an electrical floor plan. So this is your standard floor plan, just indicating where the electrical points are sitting within the space. A lighting plan or lighting floor plan, also again indicating where all your lighting equipment and accessories are sitting. A roofing plan, a plan of the roof. And a flooring floor plan, indicating all your floor finishes and your floor finish changes. These are just a couple of the ones that I use on a daily basis. You're not limited to these, obviously, but these are probably the most obvious ones that will crop up during your project as a designer. All these drawings aid in giving the builder an understanding of what you as the designer wish to achieve within that particular project or in the building environment. So because of that, all your floor plans need to be as detailed as possible. For example, in your furniture plan, you need to include every furniture piece that is going to be sitting within that space. If you don't include your dining room table and someone puts an electrical fitting right in the middle of the floor, you won't be able to access that, obviously, because your dining room table will be sitting right on that. If you are building a kitchen and you don't indicate all the electrical points in your kitchen space, the builder may not build the electrical points in, or your electrician may not put all the electrical points in, and therefore your kitchen will be without electricity, and that is a big problem. So as you can see, information is key, and adding all the relevant details is very vital to these plans. As the designer, we generally create most of our floor plans or our plans on computer-aided software programs such as AutoCAD and Revit. We use this to supply the client and the building team as an indication of what needs to be taking place on the building site. These plans will also take our projects from the beginning stages to completion stages. And essentially what you've drawn on your plans needs to be reflected in the final result on your project. So what you see on your floor plan in your drawing, when you walk onto site as the designer handing over the project for completion, everything should be as per your plan. Before we get any further into this lesson, let's take a look at some of the vital terminology that is going to crop up along your interior design journey. Firstly, we're going to look at scale, dimension, schematic design, and lastly, we're going to have a look at concept. Let's start with scale. Scale is a drawing that is drawn where the dimensions are proportional to reality. They are scaled to the actual size of the object being drawn in a predetermined ratio. This is really helpful when drawing a really large building from reality onto your computer or by hand so that it fits into a realistic sized piece of paper. You're not going to draw a 10-meter building on a 10-meter sized piece of paper. This essentially is working with ratios. So the real size has been worked out at a ratio to fit onto a drawing. So let's look at an example. If you had a drawing ratio of 1:20, your drawing would be drawn at a ratio of 1/20th of the actual size of the building in reality. Next, we look at the term dimension. This is a really important term and something that will crop up quite a lot on your journey as interior designers. Dimension means the numerical value expressed in units of measurements and used to indicate size. So on your floor plans and layout plans, you're going to find a lot of dimensions. Dimensions give the size to buildings, to room spaces. It gives us the size of length and width to the spaces that we're working with. So dimension is a numerical value used to express the size of a space. Next, we look at the term schematic design. A schematic design is a set of drawings that describes a building. So like we looked at earlier, we had plan sections, elevations, we had floor plans, we had building plans, wet work plans. That is your schematic design. We'd use all of those together to describe what's happening within that building. The next important term we look at is concept. The concept is the initial idea behind any design project or any design. So what idea did you start off with that led you to your final project? Don't worry, this is something we're going to hash out a little bit more as we dive into module 2, but for now you have a really good idea or an understanding of what concept is. Now that we know the lingo, let's get back on track. Floor plans are essential when it comes to designing any project or home, from office renovation to restaurants to stores. This is especially important when creating a space that may need to be rented out for a business or for a new homeowner. Let's take a look at an example of this floor plan and see if you can identify some of the vital information that a floor plan needs to include. Think back to the slides that we've just looked at. What vital information does a floor plan need to include? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box, or you can simply jot them down in your sketchbooks. In the meantime, I'm going to give you a little hand and help you with some of the vital information that I can pick up in this floor plan. Firstly, we can see that it shows us the scale of the space. It's really important that a floor plan shows us the scale and proportion of the rooms in relation to one another. It also shows us where the furniture has been placed. We can clearly see where the master bedroom is. We can see where the bed has been placed in relation to the bathroom, in relation to the entrances and exits. This also then gives us a great idea of the traffic flow, how one maneuvers themselves around the space. Is there enough space between the bed and the wall to walk around? Has there been enough space allocated in the bathroom for someone to wash their face or have a shower or walk around internally and externally? And lastly, it shows us the entrances and exits within the space. Where does a person enter the room? Where do they exit the room? Where is the entrance to the house? Where is the exit to the house, etc.? Very vital information. On your screen is a really basic, quickly drawn rough floor plan or sketch plan. In this lesson, we're going to look at combining our sketching techniques with drawing up a floor plan, and I'm going to call them your communication plan. These are rough, quick sketch plans that you would use on site or with a client when you need to draw up something quick or communicate something quickly. In this lesson, we're going to combine the sketching techniques from lesson 1 with your floor plan techniques in this lesson to create your very own communication floor plans. This is a communication tool. Do you see how the space on your screen shows us enough information without actually having any written information? We can see proportion, we can see traffic flow, and we can see entrance and exit points. This is what we are going to learn. We now know what the plan is. We need to look at where the plan fits into your project timelines. So when it comes to any project, as a designer, you would typically have something called a project timeline. And this is a timeline of what typically needs to happen at what point in the project. Do any of you know what a basic project timeline looks like, or what phases may be involved? I know it's quite a difficult question up front, but let's try and give it a go. Where does the project plan fit into the timeline? Understanding the project timeline and the nature of a project timeline in interior design can be a really tough nut to crack. We're going to start off with the basics and build on them as we go along, so that by the end of this module, you should be able to be teaching your very own module on project timelines. Just a little tip from the industry professionals: set realistic timeline expectations. Success in the real world is very different to how you see timelines progressing on television. Realistic timelines is key to a happy client or happy customer. Generally, with every project we take on as designers, there's a little thing, as you know, called the project timeline. I'm going to show you a typical timeline of how projects run from the moment you meet your client to the moment you hand over your keys back to the client for final project handover. The steps that I'm going to show you are typical steps that I take on my projects and steps that I feel work best. Firstly, we start off by obtaining our brief, and that simply means meeting with the client and getting a brief idea of what they want to do on their projects. Secondly, we have a schematic design phase. Thirdly, we have concept development phase. Fourth, we have construction documentation phase. Fifth, we do construction maintenance. And lastly, we have our project handover phase, which is essentially an administration phase. We're going to take a look at these project timeline headings in a little bit more detail, and we start off with the project brief. Obtaining the project brief, a really exciting part of the project, something that really gets your juices flowing to start creating, but something that needs to be taken very seriously. Let's break that up. The first step to any project is getting the brief. So typically you would get a brief from a client. If you're working for a design firm, you may get a brief from your team lead or your boss or your manager. And if you were creating your own space, let's say you were renovating your kitchen or redoing your home, even in that case, you would need to write down your project brief. A project brief is the starting point to any project. How are you supposed to know how to proceed if you don't know what the client is expecting? Next on our list is schematic design. This is your phase 2. Schematic design, we clarify the vision of the space or project. We gather all the relevant information. So we look at a brief, we get site surveys of the space or the project, and we formulate a strategy. How are we going to take the project from A to B? At this point, the designer would use all the information gathered and develop 2 or 3 layout options for consideration of the client, which are generally presented in a sketch format. And this is where your sketch communication comes to play. So you may be sitting at a table with your client, you've got your survey, you've got an idea of the building, and the client says, okay, let's give it a bash. Where am I going to put my kitchen? In that instance, you would take your pencil or pen, piece of paper, and sketch out your ideas. Next, in phase 3 is our concept development phase. This is where you start to conceptualize your project. What I mean by this is you generate a broad outline of function and form of your project in segmented pieces. Here we start looking at the interaction, the expectation, the experience someone wants to achieve within that space. We look at the processes that need to be happening and the processes that need to be performed. So the concept development is your initial idea of how you see your project turning out, and watching that develop. We develop the concept within this phase or in this sector. Next phase we look at is the construction, development, and documentation phase. This is the point where your designer literally goes from taking the project up in the air or in paper phase right to the project development phase. In the design development phase, the schematic plans and elevations are reviewed and revised and expanded to make sure that we've incorporated all the detail and specifications required for construction. So we might have had an idea of finishes that we're wanting to use, but in this phase we have an idea of the exact finish and where that finish would be purchased. We have an idea of exactly what plumbing points we're going to be using and where those points are going to be allocated. So as you can see, a lot more detail in this phase. Next, we look at our construction maintenance phase. This is the point where we start the bidding phase for contractors and specialists. You will send your drawings out and they will come back with all of their quotes and pricing. The construction documentation processes are assessed and then distributed to the relevant teams that are working on your project. This is also part of the project where we get onto site and start coordinating the project with our contracting teams. Next, we jump into the handover and admin phase. This is the final phase to our project timeline. This is the point at which all final invoices are sent out. We try and get everything tied up as much as we can at this point so that we can hand over to the client. A little thing called project snagging happens here, where the site is complete, but the designer and the contractors and the client do a final walkthrough to see if everything has been constructed to standard and as per client's requirements. And then lastly, the project gets handed over at this point. Based on the above phases to the timeline that we've just looked at, can any of you tell me which phase we first see the inclusion of your project plan? Where do we see the start of the project plan? Can you think? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which phase? You can pop your answers into Morpheus, or you can simply jot them down in your sketchbooks for future learning. The answer you're looking for is that we start to see the inclusion of a plan in phase 2, the schematic phase. After we've obtained the brief, we can then proceed to measuring up the client space and gathering all the information we need via the project brief. From there, we can sit down with the client and start drawing up these plans. Without this information, we aren't able to draw up our plans. Before interior design became a recognized profession or a prominent term, interior design had one main function: to coordinate with architecture of buildings. The profession of interior design came with the rise of middle-class society and complicated architecture that rose to popularity during the Industrial Revolution. And that's something we're going to cover in our history of design, so don't worry. But did you know that we can look as far back as ancient India and Egypt and see the use of plans in their artwork and interiors? An architect wore the hat of both architect and interior designer during these times to be able to fully reach the entire project's objectives. So quite a lot of work for one person. This can be seen in the references of the architect Vlkolínec, a god found in Indian mythology. In these references, we see sculptures and illustrations of ancient Egyptian texts and events and even places constructed during the 17th century in India. Vlkolínec is also known to be the creator of the world, so he is the god of architecture. Incredibly interesting that architecture and interior design dates back this far. One of the very first references we start to notice regarding sketch and 2D communication is through the scripture in the ancient Egyptians' paintings on the walls in their tombs, and obviously this is referred to as hieroglyphics. Ornate gold ornaments found in Egyptian tombs played a huge role in symbolizing the wealthier and powerful Egyptians. This is just another insight to the start of interior design. I think for me the best known example of ancient Egyptian architecture is the Egyptian pyramids. Ancient Egyptian architecture and design displayed some of the most intricate and exquisite architecture and works of art throughout history. Most of the architecture and design represents their belief in life after death and their praise to their gods. Due to the fact that they had limited timber available, they made use of stone, brick, and mud, which was used to construct the majority of their buildings. Timber, however, was used for the more precious buildings, such as temples and pyramids, as this was a lot more difficult to come across. During 2649 BC to 2150 BC, we see some of the first architecture and design in Egypt. This set a standard for Egyptian art and architecture to date. It was during this time that the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx were built. So as you can see, ancient Egyptian architecture is really where we first start to see the first signs of architecture and design. Really far back, but something that has created foundation to interior design and architecture to date. Before we go any further into your lesson, I want to give you a quick sneak peek into our next lesson, lesson 3, where we will be taking our floor plans and drawing them into elevations. This is really going to bump up your skill set, and it's a vital part of the design process because we know where we need to gather the information from, and now we're going to add our heights and our widths. Another very practical lesson, and most definitely one not to be missed. But again, that's for next lesson. Let's make sure we know everything about plans before we get there. Let's get back into our plans, and we start off by learning how to draw up our very first floor plan. Now that we have a clear idea of what floor plans are, we're going to look at how to create our own floor plans. We start off by looking at the key characteristics of a good floor plan, or when you're starting any project. Let's look at some of the elements that need to be considered when creating your floor plans. Firstly, we need to look at versatility. We need to look at optimizing layout. We need to look at traffic flow. We need to look at size and proportion. And number 5, we need to look at practicality. So these are all elements that you need to consider when creating your floor plan. Firstly, we're going to start with versatility and flexibility. Versatility is probably the key element that will make your clients fall in love with you and your project. Creating a plan that is versatile is making sure that you've included areas for growth and potential change, like bonus areas. So, for example, you may have a client that is a family of 2 at the moment, has 3 bedrooms in the house, and has mentioned to you that they are possibly going to have a couple of children. In your design or in the back of your mind, you would make sure that you're planning for that point. So maybe the office room now could be turned into a children's room later. Versatility could bring in extra income to a rental studio, so your client may be looking to rent out a space. It may add more heads at a later stage to an office environment if that office environment was thinking of expanding. This is all in the versatility and flexibility of your designs. Allow the client to be able to make changes to the spaces later. Next on our list is optimize your layout. Think hard and long about the client and relate relate that to the functions that need to be taking place within your spaces. So you need to plan with this in mind. For example, if you had young children, you wouldn't necessarily allocate rooms right next to an entertainment area or in a kitchen. An example of a common planning consideration to take into thought, a bathroom shouldn't necessarily face into a common entertainment area. And obviously that is because you don't want your guests looking straight into your bathroom. Next, we look at layout flow. The flow needs to fit your priorities and the lifestyle. Ensure that the flow of the space is in line with the client's priorities. For example, in a doctor's room, you wouldn't put your reception desk somewhere where it's not accessible for the patients, as the patients need to access this on a regular basis. If you were entertaining in a home environment, it would be important to make sure that there's good flow from the kitchen into the outside space or living area. Next, size matters. Take quantity of people that will make up the space into consideration. How many people are going to be performing a function within these spaces? Whenever designing a room or a hallway, think about how many people will be in that space at one time and then allow enough size to fit. Do they have room to move around? Can you open up your arms? Can you swing around? Do we need to be adding extra space for the functions that are taking place in these areas? Size matters. Next, be practical. And this is probably one of the most important considerations to think about. A good plan takes into consideration the practicalities of the space before they add any detail and pretty fixtures. Think about the safety of the children, the cleaning aspects, heating and cooling bills for the future family or the future inhabitants of that space. Think about all of this stuff before falling in love with the crazy impractical designs that could possibly happen. So, practicality over aesthetics. Those are the elements that we need to think about when designing our floor plans. Now we need to know what information needs to be included on our floor plan if we're creating standard layouts for a focused floor plan area. What should be included on your floor plans? Let's take a look. Firstly, we need to include your walls, doors, and windows. We'd need to include some sort of a floor indication. We'd need to include stairs, fixtures and fittings, some text and room names, because obviously notation is a good idea, some sort of scales to show the proportion between each room or each area, and then absolutely show some sort of dimension. This is essentially going to be your checklist for your floor plans. So keep this handy when you start drawing up your very own floor plans. But in the meantime, we're going to break it up a little further. As you know, we're going to need to add our doors. So the doors of the house are represented on the floor plan and indicated not where they're installed, but which direction they're going to move in. So as you can see in your little image on your screen, the doors are showing the swing of the door. So if it's entering from backwards or from the front or inwards or outwards, very important on your floor plan. And then obviously we need to add our walls. The walls are arguably the most important part of the floor plan because they effectively determine the size and shape of the house and how many rooms and how the rooms are laid out. It also gives us a really nice idea of proportion. So the walls are important and probably something to start with. Then obviously next we're going to need to add our windows. Windows give us a good idea of ventilation and natural light points within the space. The windows on the floor plan are illustrated using an unfilled block in areas along the wall. So if you have a look on your screen in the windows block, we can see there's a wall and then a clear indication of the window. It's an unfilled block. Next, we need to add our floor finishes, any sort of stairs or floor finish changes in level, and then our fixtures and fittings. When we speak about floor finishes, we're talking about what kind of floor finish will be allocated to the area. And in most instances, there is generally not one floor finish throughout the house or throughout the project. So in the kitchen area, you might have tiles, so you'd indicate tiles and then the square meterage for those tiles so that we know how many tiles to order. And then in your bathroom area, or let's say in your lounge, maybe you've got a carpet in your lounge, you'd indicate that that area is a carpeted area and you'd give the square meterage or the square foot value for that as well, again, so that we know how much to order. When we speak about stairs, I'm talking about floor finishes. So on your floor plan, you'd indicate little rectangular blocks to indicate the stairs, and obviously a very vital piece of information on your floor plan because it shows a change in level or height. And then we need to add our fixtures and fittings. So by fixtures and fittings, we're talking about any loose furniture items or even built-in furniture items. This gives us a good idea of traffic flow and how people are going to maneuver within those spaces. So just as an example, fixtures and fittings in this image would be your couch, your coffee table. You can include the little rug on the floor, but those kinds of instances and elements. Next, we need to include our text, our scale, and our dimension. So when we speak about text, we need to add any room names or notation. So as you can see in the image on your screen, we've got a little image saying bedroom 3. So obviously we know that that is the bedroom number 3. Any kind of text in neat handwriting is really vital to these plans. And then the scale of the plan. So I don't know if you remember, a couple of slides back, we looked at the scale and how important scale was. Scale is the ratio of how something is drawn to reality. So that's obviously important so that the person reading the drawing knows at what scale the drawing is drawn to. And if there's no dimensions, they're able to scale that drawing to reality without even using a ruler. Next, we look at the dimensions. Dimensions are vital to your plan as they give us an indication of the size of the room, and it really helps us when we're looking to order or place orders for quantities of certain materials or finishes, and also just gives us a general idea of the scale as well. Next, we're going to look at how to draw up our floor plan. So we're going to take that information and implement it into our very own floor plan. But first, we're going to look at the tools. What tools do we use to create these floor plans? We can either sketch our floor plans by hand, or we can use computer-aided software. So for this lesson, we're going to be sketching our floor plans by hand because, as you know, we're creating communication floor plans. But if we were using computer-aided software, we could think about using software such as AutoCAD, Revit, Photoshop, 3D Max, and so many more. Don't worry, these will be covered in your modules 3 and modules 4, but for now, we're going to be sketching. Let's get going. We are going to start by selecting the space that we're wanting to measure up. We're going to start from outside of the wall and work our way in. We're going to add any external windows and doors. We'll draw any internal walls and doors. We'll then follow that with details and measurements, and then finally finishing off our drawing by labeling. So this is your drawing checklist. Let's take a step-by-step look at how we go about doing this. And we're going to select the space and measure, starting with step 1. Step 1. Select the space you want to draw up. The first step is generally to select the space and measure it up. In our case, we're going to skip the site survey or measuring up phase, as we're going to only cover this in our module 3. For now, you're going to measure with your eyes. Unless you feel comfortable with measuring, in that case, you can go ahead and please take measurements of the space. So we'll start off by picturing yourself sitting with your client that they've asked you to draw up their space. Can you show me where you'd remove that wall? Or they may say, where are we going to allocate our kitchen? In this instance, a simple sketch of the floor plan would suffice. Let's move on to step 2. We start from the outside and work our way in, and by this I refer to your external walls. So I'd suggest standing in the space that you're going to be sketching and look at all the walls and look at how the space is being constructed. You would start by lightly drawing in the shape of the building, so the external lines of the building. So for this example, I'm using quite a basic shape. I'm starting with my rectangular shape, drawing in my external lines in pencil, and then to give the wall a bit of thickness, on the inside, I'm drawing in the same lines at a different thickness. I'm then following that up with taking a darker Koki pen and then giving that wall a little bit of thickness. So I'm tracing the same line of the wall with a Koki pen as well as the inside and giving it thickness. What you can do to take this a step further is color in that wall solidly with that black Koki pen. Next, step 3, add your external doors and windows. Just a simple line for a window and an arc for a door. So as you can see on my example, I'm adding my external doors, I'm showing which way they swing, and then I'm giving an idea of where the windows are as well. Step 4 is to add your internal walls and doors. Now it's time to lay out the interior walls and doors of the proposed plan using quite light lines. Don't worry too much about being too neat or too accurate. Remember, this plan is for communication rather than accuracy. So as you can see, I've taken my pencil and I've just added very light partition walls where I see the walls in my space. So obviously when you're doing this, you're going to add the walls that you can see in your space, and this is referring to internal walls. And then we move to step 5, adding your detail. Start adding your detail to your plan, such as your fixed furnitures and mobile furniture pieces. In the kitchen, you could draw some sort of a line to indicate a worktop. So as you can see, I've just done there. You can even add indication of a hob and maybe your oven or stove. In your lounge area, you'd probably add some sort of couches and some sort of coffee table. And as you can see in the dining room, I've added a dining room table as well. In the bathrooms, you can add your toilet or your basins or showers. Other things to include could be cupboard doors, cupboards, anything that shows some sort of furniture piece and also gives us an idea of where we're maneuvering within the space. Remember here, when drawing a plan, your inner style needs to come out. So you don't necessarily need to be an artist, but I really want to start seeing you develop your style. style. Part of step 5 is to add your measurements to the space. This is where you add your measurements that you've taken off your site or from your site survey. So if you didn't do this part, please ignore the section. If you did, you can follow my steps. We'll start by taking 2 measurements of your space, the length and the width. These are your overall dimensions. So if you want to get a little bit risky, you can try and measure the length of each window and door and add this to. So as you can see, I've done very overall lengths of the house and very overall widths of the house. And then I've added that in with a little line and a star at the end. And obviously the star needs to line up with the end of the wall. And in the middle there, that is where you put your dimension. So it might be 10 feet, you'd put 10 feet there. It might be 3 meters, you'd put the 3 meters there. Next, we have step 6, and that's to label and notate everything. So you can do this in your finest and most careful handwriting and make sure things are clearly identifiable. Firstly, you can start by adding labels to each floor level. So you might have a ground floor, a first floor, a basement level, a second floor, etc. Add those in. Then in the center of each room, you can write the name of the room. And so with your bedroom, you can say bedroom 1, 2, and 3, and 4. You can do the same with your bathrooms. With your lounge area, you would put a note to say lounge area. Then you can add any other notes that you think will help this plan, or any other notes that you think are relevant to the plan. So it might be an exit or an entrance. There might be a room that needs labeling. There might be a coffee station that needs labeling. Anything that you feel needs to be communicated in this plan. Then you can see at the bottom of the drawing, I've added a plan view. I've given a scale, so what the scale of the drawing is, but obviously you need to give a correct scale of the drawing. And then I've written who it's drawn by. This is very important when doing your drawings. Always add who the drawing is drawn by. And that's it. You've mastered how to draw a very easy, quick, conversational floor plan. I hope that you guys are going to start drawing up your very own floor plans. They can be really fun and really easy to impress a client or a friend or even a family member right off the bat in your very first meetings. So please give this a go.